Are you going to go? I'm going to Okay, so without further ado, you didn't come to listen to us. We are going to welcome our online viewers joining online, which is fantastic. And can I invite Nazir Afzal to the stage? We reached out to Nazir following his involvement in the End Male Violence Against Women and Girls Commission, and it's just fantastic to invite you to Plymouth. Are you mic'd up?
I'm mic'd up. Can you hear me? Is it on? Anybody can hear me? There you go. I'm happy to use this one here. Can I say good morning to you all? And thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I've never been to Plymouth before, but I feel like I know you all. Part of the reason, as Vicky said a moment ago, was the fact that the council and the commission that you may know about reached out to me just before Christmas and said, Nazir, we've got some serious issues. Last year, we all recall the terrible murders that happened in this great city, and the response to that was not simply thinking it's too hard, it's too difficult, but what can we do differently? And so they set up a commission. I was the advisor of the commission. You probably know at the end of May they published their findings, which to my mind are extraordinarily good. I mean, most commissions and reviews, you'll know, take forever. They took 5 months. They listened to everybody. They produced a report. The recommendations are out there. Please heed them, but they're absolutely fantastic. The other reason, my other connection with Plymouth, is that lady over there in the orange top. Alexis Bowater came to me about 20 years ago when I was enrolled as chief prosecutor and in London at that time, and she said, Nazir, as a stalking victim, we are shit at stalking and dealing with stalking. That's her legal terminology that she used. And I said, well, explain. And she came and she shared with me all the terrible failings of authorities, that we just weren't dealing with the impact. I mean, the reason why, the difference between the trauma-informed policy and anything else is that when you deal with a trauma-informed policy, you're not asking somebody what's wrong with them, you're asking what happened to them. And that, I think, is a significant difference. So by asking Alexis what happened to her, we were able to look at the processes that we were undoubtedly failing on. We led on introducing brand new policy. We had national guidelines. Ultimately, we changed the law in 2012 by inventing or creating a specific offence of stalking. And it was led in large part by people like Alexis, who decided that she wasn't going to just be a victim, she was going to do something about it. And as of the Queen's birthday honours, Alexis is now an OBE, so congratulate her. And so when I was asked here to share some thoughts with you, I thought I'd go back to where it all began for me, really. About 25 years ago, when I was a baby prosecutor, that doesn't mean prosecuting babies, but when I was a junior prosecutor learning my trade, I was the first contact for the paedophile unit at New Scotland Yard, which was the national paedophile unit. I was going in there talking to senior officers about how to improve their cases, make those cases more successful. And there was one particular case. You're all adults, and I'm happy to share this with you. I recognise it might be traumatic. And I was dealing in the era of camcorders. Remember those? A mother was filming her husband raping their 18-month-old baby. And I had to prepare the case, and I observed and watched the evidence, looked at the evidence. I then prepared the case, and then I went home to my child, who at that time was 18 months old. And I realized that I didn't have a job anymore. I had a mission. There was no way that I was simply going to deal with the consequences of harm. I had to deal with harm before it even happened. And that was, I think, the turning point for me 25 years ago. But a recognition that there will be always an incident like that in your lives that makes you do something different. And the fact that you're all engaged in this area shows it doesn't have to be an incident. You have shown a passion and a commitment for tackling and protecting the most vulnerable in our society. And there are, sadly, millions of them. And they need to be heard, and they hadn't been heard. And so when I became chief prosecutor in the northwest of England, before that, when I was in London, for 10 years I was national lead on tackling violence against women and girls. I was national lead for tackling antisocial behaviour, national lead for tackling stalking, national lead. Basically, I was doing everything that nobody else wanted to do, to put it bluntly, because I get bored very easily. I decided to go for the things that were in the too difficult tray. You know, let's see, where are we with this? And time and time again, we were in the pits in terms of our performance. Agency after agency was really bad. And because what we were doing was simply going through the process, preparing a case, here's a piece of paper, forgetting that every piece of paper was a victim or a witness or a human being. We were just dealing with it in a processy type way, and ultimately, at the end of the day, we deal with an outcome. Somebody might be convicted or whatever it may be, and then this is a horrible phrase, the circus leaves town and the victim is left to deal with the circumstances thereafter. And we just moved on because we're too busy, apparently. But the reality is that by simply putting yourself in the shoes of the victim and survivor, you change. And I changed. And so I think early in the 2000s, I reached out to NGOs across the country and said, please tell me what we're not doing very, very well. And it was challenging conversations. Time and time again, there was antisocial behavior. They would say, for example, you may know the case of Fiona Pilkington, who killed herself and her daughter. She was being harassed on a daily basis by neighbors and by people in the community, and nobody listened to her. So she decided to take her life and that of her child. Because we were looking at each incident on its own, rather than the cumulative impact, the fact that it was destroying her and destroying her family and her self-esteem. We didn't look at that, but we needed to look at that. And so we did look at that. We changed our policies to enable that to happen. I'll touch a bit later on about doing that is not enough. You can't just simply change your policies. And then I reached out to other groups, and the women particularly, NGOs from women's groups said to me, Nazir, look, we're rubbish at tackling domestic abuse and violence against women and girls. Let me share some stats with you. 1 in 4 women in this country will suffer domestic abuse. I look around the room, 1 in 4 women. 1 in 5 women will be sexually assaulted. 1 in 5. 97% of women told a survey just last year that they had been sexually harassed. I think it's 100%. The other 3% just probably didn't recognize what was happening. Right? 2 women every week are killed by their partners or ex-partners. 10 women take their own lives because of domestic abuse. And that's a little heard and little said figure. When we had the ONS survey a year and a half ago, they said at least 3.1 million adults in this country were sexually abused as children. At least. That is 1 in 20 of us. So any room that you're in with 200 people, you can expect 10 people to have been sexually abused as children. That is the scale, industrial scale of the abuse that exists in our society. And I don't think people appreciated that, understood that. And that's why they dealt with it on a case-by-case basis, rather than reflecting upon what they need to do differently to prevent harm in the first place. So when I reached out, and there was large groups of women who told me, for example, about forced marriage and honor-based abuse, they said to me, Nazir, you do not understand. We're dealing with these cases day in, day out, thousands of them every year, but the state doesn't do anything. And I said, well, what should we do differently? Well, first thing we should do is we should raise awareness. Because that's a key part of trauma informed policy, raising awareness so everybody in your institution, your organization, knows something about it, knows what to do in terms of signposting. And they said, so I said, fine, I'll organize a conference. I organized a conference in central London. I invited all these parliamentarians. Guess what? They all said they were really busy watching porn. So I arranged it. I arranged the conference directly opposite Parliament. I said, pop in. And to their credit, a number of them did. And they sat and listened to victim survivors. And they went away. We need to do something about this. Why they need to do that, I don't know. But why they needed that to happen, well, it did happen. I didn't know at the time. I knew that was the first national conference on forced marriage. I didn't know. The US State Department told me, Nazir, that conference you organized was the world's first conference on forced marriage. And that tells you how bad we are across the world when it comes to some of these issues. But we needed to do things. So what we did, again, get the people around the table who know what they're talking about, the experts, the survivors. We define the terms. So you go Google terms on forced marriage, honor-based abuse, they were things that we devised and developed around the table with the people who know most about it. Then we need to bring about best practice. Best practice changes, by the way. It's not the same thing at the end from when it begins. So, it's an iterative process, but we have to start somewhere. So we developed that, and we developed it together, again, working with the survivors who knew most about this subject. They tell you what's wrong, they tell you also how you can fix it. I'm not an expert in anything, they are. They are the experts. Listen to them, bring them into the room. We then needed to raise awareness, and I've learned the hard way that the way you raise awareness is by telling stories. You talk about the cases that you have dealt with, anonymize them where necessary, but that's the way you get the message across. So when Roxana Naz was murdered by her mother, She was strangled by her mother whilst her brother held her down because she was pregnant with her boyfriend's baby. And when I prosecuted the mother was asked in the courtroom, why did your daughter have to die? She said it was her destiny. And you realize something else is at work here, over and above just homicide. It's something much more significant, much more cultural, something driven here by misogyny and by hatred of women more generally, and women not being allowed to make choices. And if they make choices, there will be consequences. And so that was one case. And then I thought about we need to stop making assumptions about what a victim looks like. So when Samara was murdered by her family, she was extraordinarily wealthy, from a very wealthy family in West London that owned loads of property. Again, people make assumptions that it's only the poor, ill-informed, uneducated, poor people that do this type of stuff. This was a really wealthy family. She fell in love with somebody, and she was taken by her mother to that boyfriend and said to that boyfriend, please wash your hands of her. This is at 10 a.m. on that April morning. When he said, I love her, 2 hours later, she was stabbed 18 times in the presence of 2 infant nieces who were splattered with her blood. Now, what does that teach us? Apart from the making assumptions about victim, it's about the speed with which things escalate. And this is another issue around trauma-informed policy, is that when somebody comes to you, do not say to them, come back tomorrow, our expert will be in, because there may not be a tomorrow. 2 hours is all it took in her case from first time she became aware of a threat to the threat being carried out. And that's why sometimes they will come to the front desk of the largest building they find, and they'll say to reception, I'm in danger. And reception will say, I don't know what you're talking about, but if you come back tomorrow, somebody might know. That's never going to be enough because there won't be a tomorrow. And that's why awareness throughout the institution and organizations is key, so that people are able to signpost where it's appropriate to do so, and in real time rather than waiting for it to happen. And then there was a particular case called Banaz Mahmood, which those of you who may have watched the film, it was a film called Honor, which Keely Hawes produced a couple of years ago. And it was this particular case. Banaz was forced into marriage at the age of 16. She was brutalized by her husband. She threatened to take her husband to the police. At the age of 18, her parents reluctantly allowed her home because they didn't want her to report her husband for rape. And then she fell in love for the first time in her life. And at the age of 19, she was seen kissing her boyfriend outside of a tube station in South London. The busybody from the community went and told her father. Her father said, that's terrible. The next thing he did was to set up a council meeting. A number of men, 7, we think maybe 8, sat around a table, not unlike the ones you're sitting at, and said, Banaz must die. No warning, no chit-chat, no threats. She must die. And she was abducted off the streets of London. One of the men who abducted her raped her. We know that because we put a listening device in his cell, and he said, I raped her because she needed to know who was in control before she died. And then she was strangled and buried in a suitcase 100 miles north. And were it not for a phenomenal officer called DCI Caroline Good, played by Keely in that film, maybe the investigation wouldn't have gone. Why? Because who reports a child going missing? A family. But if a family is responsible for the child going missing, where's that report going to come from? So you need to look beyond. In that case, it was her boyfriend that reported her missing. Ultimately, we were able to convict father and uncle of murder, and then 2 of the men fled to Iraq. And we didn't have an extradition treaty with Iraq, but we did something we don't ordinarily do, and we pressured the Iraqi government and said to them, this means a lot to us, bring them back. And they allowed them back, and we convicted them. And there are now 5 men in prison for life of the murder of a 19-year-old girl for kissing her boyfriend outside of a tube station. This is how irrational some of these things are. And we need to leave our prejudices, our assumptions at the door. We need to think about what the victim may have felt or what the victim may have said. And we're really bad at this in this country generally around how we handle crises. I prosecuted Baby P. You're familiar with the case? It's not the case. I'm going to talk to you about how we deal with it as a country. This is what we do. First thing, when something terrible happens, is we want a head to roll. Remember that? The head of social services was told she had to resign. The second thing that happened, by Ed Balls, I wonder what happened to him. The second thing that happens is that we decide that we can't allow people to use their judgment anymore. We need to introduce a brand new risk assessment tool, a tick box. Does anybody know if a tick box has saved anybody's life? It doesn't happen. So we introduced a brand new tick box, throwing out the previous judgmental policy that we had. And then the third thing that happens is that hundreds of social workers left the profession because they never felt they could do their job anymore. This is what we do. We throw out our leadership, we change everything rather than re-engineer it, we change everything and we lose our experienced talent. And the fourth thing that happened in the aftermath of Baby P was that having done all of this, more children were killed by their carers than ever before. There you go, it works. See, this is what we do time and time again. Rather than listening to the experts, listening to the survivors, acting upon what you have learned, and introducing that, and leaders doing that introduction, we throw it all out and we end up in a worse place than we were beforehand. I moved, as I think Vicky said, to the northwest of England in 2011, and pretty much immediately I became aware of the concept of so-called grooming gangs. I'd asked again, who's watched the BBC film Three Girls? Yep. The actor who plays me is much more handsome than I am. I'll take that. But that case was that film. And in that film, in that case, the young girl goes into a takeaway restaurant in North Manchester. She starts smashing it up. She's arrested by the police. She tells the police, I have been brutalized by those men. The police say, yeah, all right. And carry out a really cursory 11-month investigation during which they think she's from a broken family. She's got drug issues. She's low over criminality. She will not be listened to. And they didn't listen to her. They then presented those findings to two prosecutors who took their lead from the officer and decided, there's no jury going to believe her because I don't believe her. This is what they said. I arrived in 2011. I said, have you got anything like this? Anything of these types of cases? They brought this one to me. I said, I believe her. Why are you saying a jury shouldn't believe her? And the second thing I said was, they said, Nazir, how do we get this to the jury? How do we get this to a court? What are we going to say to the jury when we didn't believe her? How are we going to say to the jury, members of the jury, we want you to believe what she has to say. We didn't believe her. How does that work? I said, this is what we do, and this is what institutions are really bad at. We admit we got it wrong. We go into that jury and say to members of the jury, when you're going to hear that 3 years ago we didn't deal with this case properly, we got it wrong. You can imagine how that went down with my colleagues, but I was the chief, and they do what I do. So I told them that, and we did that, and we got that case to court. And ultimately, in May 2012, those 9 men were convicted of the abuse of 47 girls. Now, the important thing to be said is, one of many important things, is that had we prosecuted 3 years previously, 46 girls would have been spared. This is the consequence of not doing your job properly, is that others will suffer because the people who are the perpetrators will act with impunity. And then in May 2012, something really strange happened. On the back of one case, suddenly I'm now the world's expert. And everybody's asking me to write articles and do media to explain what's going on. Somebody had to fill that vacuum. So I did fill that vacuum. But it was important to say this. Firstly, to contextualize. I mentioned the figure of 3.1 million earlier on. 66% of sexual abuse of children happens in the family. Acquaintances. The second largest group of victims of child sexual abuse is online, and we are just scratching the surface there. For pennies right now, you can watch a child being raped for you. That is what we have to deal with, and we're not dealing with. The third largest group of victims are institutional victims, victims of places of worship, of schools, of colleges, of sports clubs, of the BBC, you name it. Institutions where you would think children are safe, but they're not. That's the third largest group. The fourth largest group, smallest by comparison to all the others, is street grooming of a type that we dealt with, or I dealt with in Rochdale. Now, that's all you hear about, though, isn't it? The media love that, and they loved it because of the ethnicity of the perpetrators, or as they perceived, and the ethnicity of the victims who were white. They had to put what they thought were white. And so they made the assumption that was what gets all the attention. As I said to you, I needed to contextualize that to explain that it's much more wider than anything else. The other thing we needed to do differently was we learned from the victims that we were really rubbish at trying these cases. We were re-traumatizing them through the trial process. That young girl, Girl A, was cross-examined by 11 barristers on behalf of the defendants. Now, I don't know who's been cross-examined here. She was there for 6 days by being told over and over again that she was a liar. On the ninth barrister, she lost her temper, and he goes, "Now we see the real you." So we had to change that too. So we went to the judiciary and said, that's just not sustainable. And so as a result of that case, if there are now multiple defendants, only one barrister can ask questions on behalf of all the barristers. And also, they will be time limited. The judge will look at the papers and say, 90 minutes is all you've got. So we know that the process was bad. We listened to how the victims were addressed and dealt with and re-traumatized, and we changed the process for others. And that is what you should be doing day in, day out. And that's because they know. They know what's wrong and what isn't right. And so the next thing that happened was once I got all these David Cameron, remember him? He rang me up and said, Nazir, what's going on in our country? I said, well, you're the Prime Minister, what are you asking me for? But I had to explain to him, almost in baby terms, literally, why it is that abuse was being happened. And the reason was simple. It wasn't the ethnicity of the perpetrators. That was an issue. The issue was that there's a cadre of people in this country, young girls, young boys, people from vulnerable backgrounds, just have no voice. They are not heard, they're not listened to, they're completely and utterly ignored. They are too difficult for us to deal with. We choose not to deal with them. Yet they are the ones that are suffering. And we had to change that. And that was where we needed to bring the change. And then something strange happened, and this is important for us, all of you, to appreciate, is that leadership, things that you're doing will have consequences for you in your personal lives. I wasn't ready for this, but the immediate aftermath of the trial, because the far right, it was the British National Party at that time, wanted to make the case that these men were all brown and the girls were all white. This is their perception, that all brown men are sex abusers. When they discovered that I was the one who prosecuted the case, they said, right, that damages our narrative somewhat. So they then presented, for the first time in my experience, fake news, put stuff on Facebook, saying that I had not prosecuted these guys, despite the fact it was all over the British media, it was in Parliament. Anyway, and their followers went for that. And so, despite the fact that I've been prosecuting serious organised criminals, horrible people, none of them had ever come to my door. Suddenly, I had far-right thugs outside of my door. I had to have a police officer outside of my door for 2 weeks. I'd tell my little kids at that time, the Prime Minister's got a police officer outside his door. That was the way I could reassure them. I had to have panic alarms placed in every room. I had to teach my children how to use a panic alarm. They could only go to school in a taxi for 3 months because that was security advice I was given. In one day, me and my teams received 17,000 letters and emails calling for me to be sacked and deported. I was born in Birmingham. I don't want to go back there, ladies and gentlemen. Right? But to make this clear to you, I came that close to quitting. And I had got every decision right in that case. I came that close to quitting because it was so damaging to my health, to my family's health, to my children's health, to the people around me. And if it wasn't for the people around me, the networks I had, the people I worked with, I think I would have quit. I remember my PA running down the corridor with a letter, "Don't show him the letter," I was getting feces through the post. That is not an existence that anybody should be subjected to, particularly when they get everything right. So what was my response? My response was simple. Right, we've shafted these victims. We need to make sure that no other victims suffer like they did. So I set up a national panel with my then boss, somebody called Keir Starmer. I don't know if you heard of him. And we set up a national panel that would look at everybody else's cases. I invited everybody, including from the southwest of England, send us all those cases that you think we've messed up. I need to revisit them and relook at them. We did. And we started prosecuting and bringing cases that, quite frankly, we had just not done before. We had reached out, and we continued to reach out to victims and survivors so they would inform our process, not just the NGOs that support them, actual victim survivors who would give us their input as to whether or not this case was sustainable or not. And we brought the cases, and we kept on bringing. And people forget that Rochdale preceded Savile. It preceded Operation U-Tree, all the cases that you're aware of, Max Clifford, Rolf Harris, Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall's a good example. I sometimes used to think that it was all about the court case, but it wasn't. Stuart Hall, we prosecuted him for the abuse of 11 women and girls, he was found guilty of 11 and not guilty of 1. I went to see the one woman he was acquitted of sexually abusing, and I said to her, she's now in her 30s, I said to her, "I'm really sorry I couldn't give you closure." And she looked me in the eyes and said, "Nazir, you gave me closure the moment you believed me." That's where it starts. It starts with somebody who has empathy, sensitivity, understanding, who listens. And we do not appreciate or value listening in the way that we used to. Well, I don't know if we ever did. Didn't we have that saying to children, "Be seen and not be heard"? Well, guess what? This is what happens when that is what you apply. If you're not listening, if you're not acting upon what you've heard, and you have to act upon what you've heard, then you are failing them big time. But we did. We produced prosecution after prosecution. We improved we had national guidelines, which we never had before. I literally spent the whole of, I don't know, a year traveling up in the country. If I had one of those T-shirts that when you go to a band, you get, it would say the Royal College of GPs, the Royal College of Midwives. I went everywhere explaining to people how they needed to change their processes. And to their credit, when you tell them a story about how they could fail, they change. And they did. And so they know, all of them have now national policy on tackling honor-based abuse, on tackling forced marriage, on tackling child sexual abuse. They now have the processes in place which they didn't have before. And in 2015, when I left the service, we had gone from being, what's the legal phrase, shit in 2011, to having, 2015, the highest conviction rate for violence against women and girls in our history. Because we worked multi-agency, we worked on listening to victim survivors, and we worked tirelessly to ensure that justice was delivered. And it was important that we changed everything, including the offer of counselling. There was misconceptions that victims were not allowed to have counselling until the trial was completed. Nonsense. All these misconceptions had existed because we hadn't addressed them, and we addressed them, and we brought the change. And that's important to recognise in many respects, because we've gone backwards somewhat. Where are we now in 2022? We have now, last year, we had the lowest conviction rate for rape and sexual offences in this country. 1.4% of reports. That is shocking. Shocking. And the blame, I'm not going to get party political, but I will say this. When you lose, you've heard that figure, 21,000 police officers, haven't you? What about the fact that's 500,000 years of experience? You cannot replace 500,000 years of experience with new officers, however passionate and committed they are, straight out of police academy or police school. Right? So it'll be another decade before we get back up to the levels of performance that we had 5 or 6 years ago. And that is shameful, because in the meantime, victims are going to be suffering and continue to suffer. And so we need to address all of those things. But there are benefits. There are massive benefits. I didn't tell you what my most recent roles are. As of last year, I'm now the new chair of the independent regulator of safeguarding in the Catholic Church. Right? They put a Muslim in charge of the safeguarding in the Catholic Church. It's a credit to the cardinal and the bishops that they've done that. It's brave of them to do so. They're bold. But they realized they were on last chance salute, that they cannot exist as they've always done. I've also been asked, this is the Grenfell heart. I've been asked to carry out a national review, or a London Fire Brigade review of fire service and the way that they deal with the culture within the organisation. And when I went to the Grenfell Memorial a couple of weeks ago, the 5th anniversary, this is what struck me. I was looking at the tower, which is still there, by the way, and I realised that 72 people died in the most deprived community in the richest borough in the country, because they were not listened to, because they were not heard. They did not have a place at the table when people decided what cladding should go on the front of that building. They were left to die. 18 of those 72 were children. It still shocks me to this day that that's what we did. When Dunblane, the terrible events of Dunblane happened, 15 children died. Within weeks, we got rid of all the firearms in this country. 5 years on, we've still got buildings with the flammable cladding on their fronts and backs, because we are not listening to the poorest communities. We're not listening to the voiceless communities. We're not listening to those who are most impacted. And that's what trauma-informed policy is about. It's by listening to those who are most impacted by these behaviors in order for you to be able to respond. And then you must respond. And then you must communicate that response. It's not enough, is it, to simply say we've done something? Because how many of you have got a policy that sits lovingly in a filing cabinet somewhere, but is never implemented? When I brought in something called protection orders, back in 2007, there was a private member's bill bringing in forced marriage protection orders, which the government of the day was not supportive of, because they said to me, Nazir, it will cost us £2 million a year to implement this. And I said, okay. So I sat down with the Attorney General, who at that time used to listen, and I sat down with the Attorney General and I said, do you know how much it costs to investigate and prosecute one homicide? £1.5 million. So if we can reduce the number of homicides by 2, we've paid for this legislation. To their credit, they supported it, it was brought in. Since 2008, there have been more than 3,500 protection orders issued. That's more than 3,500 lives saved. They owe me big time, financially. The most important thing is we saved lives because we acted upon what they told us needed to change, and we brought that change. And I'll finish with 2 stories. One is, about 25, 30 years ago, I was with a victim. I noticed that she had a wedding ring not on this finger, but on the opposite finger of her hand. I said to her, why are you wearing your wedding ring on the wrong finger? And she said, it's because they beat me black and blue and forced me to marry this guy. He wasn't there, but, she said. And I said, I looked at her, and I looked at a woman who had a life of hopelessness and of despair. I looked at a woman who had never been listened to for anything, and I realized that that was her protest. That's all she had. And therefore, it was absolutely essential that somebody would speak for her if she couldn't do so herself. And then about 6 months ago, I have a website. It's the shittiest website in the world. I've not updated it, but it has a contact page. So people contact me daily. Every day, victim survivors up and down the country and around the world contact me and say, I've been failed, please help me. And there's not a lot I can do. I'll signpost where I possibly can. But there was one email I got 6 months ago, and it said, Dear Mr. Afzal, you won't remember me. I was one of the victims of Stuart Hall. I now have terminal cancer. I have a few weeks to live. It's on my bucket list to thank you that when you brought that prosecution 10 years ago, my life began. The last 10 years of my life have been the greatest years of my life. I didn't know. I literally looked at that email for about 2 days. How do I respond? Thank you? Thank you is not the right response, is it? I just sent her my number, and I spoke to her. And it made me realize how important it is what we do is what we do. She died a few weeks later. Pretty much the last thing that she did in her life was to reach out to somebody that played a small part in changing her life, beginning her recovery. And it begins by you, I, all of us, simply listening, believing, and then acting upon that belief. Thank you very much indeed. Regrettably, I have to go off to Manchester, where I'm talking to the Sellafield Nuclear Decommissioning Authority in 5.5 hours' time. It's 5.5 hours to get there. So this is my opportunity, an opportunity for you to ask me any questions or any comments. So please take advantage of it. So anybody got any questions? Yep, there's one at the back there. Is there a microphone? Yeah, the question was what's happened to CPS. It's what's happened to all of our public services. We lost experience. I mean, never forget about me. In 2015, we did the simplest thing. When you got a budget cut, this is what you do. You get rid of your experienced staff because they're your most expensive staff. So we lost, as the police have lost, as probably every local authority and every service has lost, their most experienced staff, because that was the quickest way to reduce your budgets. That's the experience you need. When you have a multi-agency meeting, you want people around the table who know what they're talking about, who have the ear of the victim survivors, who are able to offer that. So the CPS, like every other body, unfortunately, has lost that level of experience. And it cannot replace that overnight. I mean, the government have committed to bringing in more prosecutors, more police officers, but, they'll take years and years to get up to speed. That's the problem. Anybody else? Oh, over there. I've got terrible hearing. I just wonder whether you can move forward. So thank you so much. The question is to do with what's happening in the United States of America, particularly around Roe versus Wade being overturned. I've been very outspoken about this. I continue to be outspoken about this. We would never tell a man what to do with his body. Why the hell are we telling women what to do with theirs? And I didn't get round to saying is, what the Plymouth Commission work, every bit of successful work that we've done in terms of tackling violence against women and girls begins on the fact that we're recognising that it's about male power, male control, misogyny, and the decision by the Supreme Court over there is driven by power and control. It's about male power. It's about telling women that they're not good enough and that they shouldn't be able to make choices about their lives. It's horrible to say this, but I think what the Americans are doing is as bad as the Taliban in Afghanistan, which is telling women they can't appear on TV or walk around without being. It's as bad. I always believe that. I've spent a lot of time in America. They stopped inviting me in 2016. November 2016. Who was elected? I can't remember. They stopped inviting me. Well, I used to go there quite frequently, and I thought that they understood these issues better than most. But they've gone backwards, haven't they? You've got religious intolerance, fundamentalism in effect, and it all comes down to, I've prosecuted, I hate to say this, hundreds of femicides, hundreds of women being murdered. I've prosecuted thousands of rapes. None of them were about sex. They were all about male power and male control. And so unless you address those issues, you're not addressing the problem. And what the Americans have done, unfortunately, is taken a massive step backwards. Yeah, please, online questions. No. One of the signs of old age is deafness, and oh, there you go. We have the technology. Yeah, that's very good. Yes, was it yesterday? What day is it? A day or two ago, I was in, I can't forget where I was now. That's how bad my life is. I was in Reading, and I was talking to a group of people who set up the Everyone's Invited website. Are you aware of that? That's a website that was set up by schools and colleges, and to hear young people talking about peer-on-peer abuse. Thousands of people, young people, said that they've been abused at school or in colleges, etc., etc. And so there are, and the Me Too movement you're familiar with. We're hearing all the voices of survivors. We're hearing all the voices of victims. What I think we're not doing enough of is the next bit, which is how do we respond to what's been happening. Ofsted, for example, carried out a review in the immediate aftermath of the Everyone's Invited thing and said, you need to do A, B, C, D, and E. We'll see whether that happens or not. But there is a role for online. I mentioned earlier on about the bad guys, and it's usually guys, have taken the online world by storm, and we need good people to step in there and start dealing with the issues that are presented in that thing, in that environment on those platforms. But as I say, I don't know. I'm looking to you for the answers rather than I don't have any answers. I think whilst the platform should do more, social media should do more, we're much more divided now as a country than we've ever been. People regularly say to me that their opinion is better than my facts. That's where we are. We're in a situation where facts are no longer matter anymore, and their opinion matters. I think we've got to address all of that stuff, but I think there's no substitute for finding a mechanism by where victim survivors can reach directly the people that will help them. Just to scream in the dark, which is what online platforms are generally, is not enough, is it? We've got to be able to find a mechanism whereby you are able to speak directly to an individual and provide them with a level of support that they haven't had so far. So I think it's work in progress. I hope that during the course of today's workshops, you can come up with some solutions, because I don't have any. Okay, any more online questions? Any more in-house questions? Anybody on the roof? I don't know. Yeah. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it doesn't seem like a... what was the drive? The driver for putting the cheapest cladding was so somebody can make more profits out of it. The people who were sat at that... I was sat in a memorial service at the base of the tower with Prince William and Kate, and they were hearing story after story. And people were saying over and over again, where is the clink of the handcuffs? Why is nobody being brought to justice for this 5 years on? We know what the drivers are. The drivers are people cutting corners, to enable them to make more profits because they assume that these people would never be listened to. And that is time and time again what happens. So we've got to find a way in which the most deprived, Plymouth has, I think, 1% of the most deprived community, or in the top 1%. We've got to find a mechanism by which people who are unheard are heard. And that really is the challenge for you all. And again, I look forward to your workshop proposals because, quite frankly, we're not getting them from government. They talk over and over again about levelling up and let's hear from everybody. They don't like what they hear and they ignore it then. So the solutions will have to be local. And I think that you in the Southwest have a real opportunity, given the networks you've developed, to be able to find those kinds of solutions. But I agree with you as to what the drivers are. It's about people making money and people who are really poor not having a voice. You're welcome. Thank you so much.